Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Israel Dialogues. We are excited to be offering our winter semester, as it were, of this incredible program. To those of you who are returning to us, welcome back. To those of you who have found us for the very first time, welcome for the first time. This program exists because of the generosity and sponsorship of our members. And so if you care to sponsor this program and help it continue to thrive and succeed, please be in touch with me at skaye@holyblossom.org. I'm happy to have that conversation with you at any time. We are at a particularly wonderful period of time inside of our Torah. Of course, this week we begin the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and as a result, our people begin their journey back to the land of Israel. So what better time could it possibly be to begin our journey back to Israel inside of these Israel dialogues? And I want to give a special thanks to Mark and to David, who every time I think they have just composed an ideal list of scholars, journalists, ambassadors, speakers. They take themselves up another notch and really just bring us even more brilliant, thoughtful, on-point people. And today is a perfect example of that. And so I'm going to pass it over to David DeWitt, Professor David DeWitt, to introduce our panel and to introduce the guest that we are having today, who has an incredibly important perspective on what is going on in the land of Israel at this time, both in regards to its elections and to its future and to what has changed. And so it's my pleasure to hand it over now to David.
Thanks very much, Rabbi. It's great to have everyone back. Welcome. And let me add, in particular, thanks to Derek, who not only connected us with Noah and extended the invitation, but has been instrumental in identifying a number of the experts who are going to be joining us in our programming over the next 2.5 months. So this is the first of our of what will be at least 8 sessions running through March under the Israel Dialogues banner. And our thanks to Holy Blossom for providing the venue, and to Les Rothschild and his colleagues in the Israel Engagement Committee who support this. And with that, I'm not going to introduce Noa, though I've had the pleasure of speaking with her, and for a longer time, the pleasure of reading her articles in Haaretz. Let me invite my colleague, Derek Penzler, who's going to moderate the session. Derek, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Great. I'm just going to move myself into gallery here. Hi, everyone. Hi, Noa. It's nice to see you again.
Hi.
The last time I saw you, I think, was at St. Anne's about 5 years ago or something, 6 years ago.
Right.
So thank you, Noa, for joining us. I'll just introduce you very briefly that Noa is now the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz, which I think is a newspaper known to everyone who's on the call. It's not just Israel's oldest daily, it's arguably, I think, definitively its best. Noa has also worked as the head of Haaretz's English edition and as a member of the newspaper's editorial board. And before joining Haaretz, Noa Landau worked for Galei Tzahal and for Channel 10 Israeli television, and wrote for Ma'ariv, one of Israel's other newspapers. Where I know Noa from is from her time at Oxford, when she was at the Reuters Institute for the study of journalism. She's now a member of their advisory board, as well as an alumna. And just a few years ago, Noa Landau was chosen as one of the 50 most influential women in Israel by Forbes magazine. So it is...
Apparently, I'm not influential enough.
Good point. But, you can't do it alone. So maybe after today, the 39 people on the call, maybe we can all together do something. And maybe I'll ask you what we can do. But now I forget now, I have some questions for you that I could ask you, or did you want to give a presentation before we ask questions, or should I just ask you questions?
I thought it's a conversation. I think that would be best.
All the better. So what I'll do is I'll ask you some questions. We'll have a bit of a conversation, then we'll turn it over to everybody else, and there'll be more questions. So I want to ask you about a word that I had never heard of. I speak Hebrew well, but there was a Hebrew word I came across a few years ago called hadata. which in English means religionization, which makes no sense because we don't really have that word in English. But evidently it became a very important word in Israel in the last years. And it made me realize that the November elections and the formation of the new Israeli government is not something that came out of nowhere. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this phenomenon that this word describes, and to what extent could we possibly have seen coming what we got in the November elections and their aftermath.
So first of all, thank you everyone for inviting me. And this is a great opening, Derek. The word Hadatta, I think started with, this is a word that the secular camp uses to describe the way that Israel is becoming, that the public sphere in Israel is becoming more religious. The erosion of the separation between religion and state in Israel. Not that there was a separation to begin with, but the erosion of the separation, that the little bits that still were. This is a word that seculars in Israel use to describe the efforts by the religious community to kind of take control of the public sphere in Israel. And it's very much also debatable if what we see in Israel is actually a one-way journey towards a more religious country, or seculars also affect the religious population. So what I mean by that is that we now know that we live in what many scholars describe as a post-secular era, which means that the fantasy that maybe liberals had, that modernization and education and scientification of the world will result in less religious people and less religion. It felt, I think, probably around after September 11th, like other things that were suddenly being questioned, that also suddenly became a question. Is the world really becoming less religious? And I think in Israel, you can also say that it's part of that trend. Israel started as a pretty secular socialist endeavor. And along with the years, I think many of those people who founded the state as this secular socialist endeavor, they envisioned the country continuing to being that sort of, having that sort of atmosphere. And what they realized with changes in demography also, and other sociological changes, is that they're actually experiencing that post-secular era where actually religion is definitely live and kicking and even growing in terms of demographics. So that word Hadatta is something that mostly seculars use to describe this phenomena that religion is not shrinking in Israel, but growing.
Well, that's fascinating, because I mean, the word religion can mean almost anything. So, in Israel, Hadatta could mean anything from an increasing number of people who are attending synagogue, or who are shomrei mitzvot, keeping commandments in their private life, in their, dietary laws or something. But I suspect that in Israel, the phenomenon of public religion seems to have a different meaning. That's directly tied up with politics. So the fact that the incoming Knesset, I believe, is it 32, 33 members of the Knesset are Orthodox? Something in that.
So almost half of the coalition is religious in terms of the individuals, but also, there are some secular individuals within the framework of a religious party.
So you said about half the coalition, or more than half the coalition, I think about a quarter of the Knesset as a whole. And that is the highest in history. But to what extent it is possible to talk about some sort of process of greater religiosity in Israel without a specifically political dimension? That it seems that the government that's being formed is not just a bunch of people who happen to be Orthodox, but it seems to consist of people for whom orthodoxy and certain political points of view are inextricably linked.
Yeah, so in Israel, whenever you talk about demography, it's very deterministic in the sense that people assume, even the best academics assume, that there is inherent correlation between the fact that someone is religious and the whole package of what it means politically. I, by the way, don't think that it's a necessary, I mean, this correlation is not necessary. I mean, I grew up in a religious family and I'm not religious. So it is possible to still, you know, be a part of a certain demography and still have different also political opinions. I don't think it's that deterministic. And also, I think that certain religious communities also change themselves. There is a great researcher in Israel, her name is Yochi Fisher, who studies religion and secularism in Israel. And she wrote this wonderful essay on how, yes, maybe the Israeli society is becoming more religious in some sense, but on the other, the religious community is also being affected by secularism. For example, the whole idea of nationalism is, of course, a part of secularism. But even she has a better, more specific example, which is the whole issue of the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa. In terms of religious ideas, it's not allowed by halakha and rabbis to go to Temple Mount. But you see that more and more religious people in Israel that are more nationalistic, they do go more and more, and they argue that this is some kind of an individualist rebel even against rabbis. So there is also an effect of secularism on religious people. Now, of course, religion in Israel is, well, everything is political, right? Everything is always political. But it's true that religion in terms of policies is something that we see this government is different than previous governments in the sense that for this government, it's not only a question of individual Knesset members' religiousness, but it's their policy is religious. So this government is indeed the most religious, also the most far right, the most extreme government Israel ever had in its history. And it is very openly and publicly promoting religious ideas that up until now were seen by seculars as against the status quo. So, for example, one of the first things that the old new Minister of Transportation, Miri Regev, said was that they're no longer going to keep with the working. They're building this light rail in Tel Aviv, and she said they will stop. The work during Shabbat, and basically this means that this is going to have huge implications in terms of timeline and budgets. And this is something that seculars in Tel Aviv that are really, you know, they're dreaming about this light rail for more than 10 years now. This is really going to affect their lives. We didn't see yet any direct threats on secular lifestyle in terms of a day-to-day interference. But for example, the fact that parts of the education ministry were taken out of the central ministry and given to this very far-right, extreme, even fringe figure within the coalition named Avi Maoz. And he already declared that he's basically going to be in charge of all the extracurricular programs funded by the education ministry. And he already said that he's not going to allow any program that doesn't fit with his worldview, which is fundamentally religious. So that, for example, is something that now worries a lot of seculars. And some of the secular mayors in Israel already declared that they are going to fund this municipally by themselves from their own municipal budgets. to compensate for whatever he's not going to be willing to fund. For example, he's very anti-LGBT, women rights, a lot of issues that are definitely considered mainstream in Israel today. And we saw that there's pretty much wide public outrage and protest about that, especially LGBT rights. So I think that, yes, on one hand, we see that religion takes a greater part in politics and public life, but that doesn't necessarily mean that individuals or that Israel as a whole is actually becoming more religious on the private level.
Right. No, this makes sense. And I appreciate what you were saying about the filtering of secular nationalist ideas into the religious sphere. And that leads to a kind of two-part question. And after that, I'll turn things over to my colleagues. But one part of the question is that the most notorious component of the new coalition is it's three separate parties that ran together. You mentioned Avi Maoz's very small party, Noam, the inaptly named Noam. Then there's Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, he wears a kippah. What that means, I'm going to ask you about. And then you have the party Religious Zionism, headed by Bezalel Smotrich. So these are three different parties. They obviously have certain commonalities, but they are three different parties with three different distinct views. So when you actually look inside these parties themselves, what does religion mean to these parties?
You know, I remember on a personal note that once I said in an interview that I grew up in a Dati Leumi family, which basically means religious nationalist family. That's how in Israel basically you describe modern Orthodox, but actually it's not like modern Orthodox at all. And I remember my mother read this, that I said that I was born in a religious national family, Dati Leumi, and she said, "Why nationalist? That doesn't describe us at all." And I thought about that afterwards, that this is interesting, that this is a unique description that we have in Hebrew in Israel for like knitted kippah families, or what you call abroad modern Orthodox. But actually it also embeds a political view, which doesn't necessarily isn't inherent to that definition. And of course, we see, I'm now speaking with a congregation. I have no idea, what are your individual views, but we know that there are many congregations in the diaspora of Jews who are, of course, religious and liberal, or even progressive. In Israel, this is something that is becoming mutually exclusive almost, and it's very interesting. It doesn't have to be, but this is what's happening. So you see that there are a lot of when you say that when you talk about religion in Israel, of course, it goes hand to hand with a certain package also of politics, unfortunately. On the other hand, you see that there's also a larger group in Israel of people who describe themselves as Masorti, which is again something that is lost in translation, because in the United States, at least, I don't know if in Canada as well, but the Masorti movement is the conservative movement. Well, in Israel, it actually means people who are traditionalist, people who have a sense of respect or nostalgia or all sorts of connections to religion, but are not religious themselves. And that would probably describe a lot of Likud voters who, on one hand, respect religion as a national idea, as a culture, as a tradition and heritage, but their everyday lives are secular, and they want to still be able to go to see football matches on Saturdays. By the way, one of the ministers did say before the elections that he's against football matches on Shabbat, and people were really this is one of their suggestions that will never happen in Israel. People were really upset about that. So I think there's a certain link between religion, especially Judaism, and politics in Israel in a way that we do not really see in world Jewry.
So that describes the Dati Leumi camp, which can range again from the more Masorati. Obviously, it's taking on some kind of other meaning, though, for someone like Smotrich or for Itamar Ben-Gvir, that Jewishness or Judaism, that's the problem. The word Yahadut in Hebrew can mean two things, right? It can mean Judaism and it can mean Jewry, Am Yisrael, the same thing in German. We have different words in English. And it means something different for them than it does maybe for the Masorati. And the other half of the question, though, is about the Haredim, who traditionally were either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. I think the term anti-Zionist was a bit exaggerated because the truly hardcore anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox Jews were that was one group, but there were, I'd say non-Zionist was probably historically a better term. But that's changed in recent years as we seems to be that Haredim are becoming more comfortable, to take your point about absorbing certain aspects of secular Zionist ideals or nationalist ideals. And then we have the phenomenon that's even more confusing of people in the Dati Leumi camp who seem to be adopting a good deal of the Haredi lifestyle and who are known as Hardalim, right? Haredi Dati Leumi, or people who eat a lot of mustard, because I guess that's what the joke is from the Hebrew word hardal for mustard. So if you could talk a little bit about this latest development where the division between the Haredi and the Dati Leumi camp seems to be melting.
Yes, it's quite interesting that at the beginning, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, used to decide whether they want to join a coalition or not based on community interests. They wanted especially budgets and other benefits for their communities. They were lobbying for these benefits, and that's how they chose basically which coalition to join. Although I have to say that also in the past they usually went with the right wing. Rabin's government was a unique situation where you had Aryeh Deri and Shas joining, but basically they did lean and tend to go with the right wing. Of course, if you think about the fact that there is indeed a mixture in Israel between religion, ethnicity, and nationalism, then of course this makes sense, that this is a common ground for all of these various right-wing parties. But in recent years, we see that the young ultra-Orthodox, also within the Ashkenazi parties and also within Shas, are more and more right-wing themselves, not just as a community interest or general trend, but it's on the individual level. They're much more right-wing, the younger voters. And we saw that very, very clearly because Ben-Gvir's party and Shas were actually competing over voters. People who voted, people were asking themselves if they should vote for Shas or Ben-Gvir. They were really contemplating the two options, and it was a real competition for Shas, which made them also more extreme and vocal about their right-wing politics, because they needed to compete with Ben-Gvir, who is very he says things quite bluntly. So they did too. And this is definitely something that we're seeing. The younger ultra-Orthodox are more are leaning to the right wing. And also, I think an interesting phenomena is you see that Ben-Gvir, on one hand, really tried not to emphasize the fact that he's religious. He is religious, but he really tried to appeal, because he ran in the same party as Smotrich, And Smotrich is really the leading figure of what was once the Mafdal, but you can't really compare the Mafdal to what is happening now to this party, to the religious Zionists. So because he knew Smotrich already has that crowd, Ben-Gvir really tried to attract traditionalist Israelis to this party without emphasizing the fact that he himself is religious.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, I could go on with lots of questions, but I want to open things up to my friends and colleagues. So Frank, I forget who had their little yellow sticky up first, but I just see Howard first on the screen. So first Howard and then John.
Well, Derek, you started with language, and I want to go back to language. The use of the word religious. There's already problems there, as it seems to have been recognized already in the conversation. After all, you're talking to an audience that belongs to a synagogue, and it's a religious audience. And there's a tendency in Israel to identify religion with orthodoxy. And I think you did it, Noah, yourself when you talked about growth. The Reform congregations have been growing as a liberal movement in Israel, but they're not zero, they're growing. It happens to be that Haredim are growing much more, and I think that's from demography. Further, I think it's a slight against the Muslims because we had Abbas running a religious party. And so identifying religion with this anti-liberal nationalism and calling it just religious, I think it's a mistake in use of language. Even in Israel, with its unusual, very different version of it. The second thing, more a question than a comment, is the big influence which you've referred to of demography. The trend, when you have the birth rate of the ultra-Orthodox growing so fast, and the predictions of how much school space they're going to occupy and how many pupils in schools, that the percentage that will be ultra-Orthodox, you get a sense of a very pessimistic view because the sense of them becoming liberal is much less chance from statistics than otherwise. So I'd like you to comment on that latter part and maybe on the former as well.
So thank you. On the former, are you saying that the reform movement is growing in Israel?
Yes, I'm saying it's growing, and I'm saying it's also religious.
Yes.
So using the word religious to only identify the illiberal
Right.
is a bias against reformers who think they're religious, but they're liberal and progressive.
So there is a small liberal religious community, especially in Jerusalem. The reform movement might be growing in Israel, I'm not sure, but it is still an anecdote comparing to other religious streams in Israel. For the average Israeli, being the options are usually when the average Israelis think about religion, they usually envision it as orthodoxy because that's what they see. I think this is also that this has to do with the way that the Mafdal had control over the education ministry for many years, and they did not want to see the reform movement in Israeli schools, for example. It was the Orthodox way or none, which is a shame. But I think unfortunately, I don't think the reform movement is growing as much as other congregations, as much as Orthodoxy. But regarding your second point, this is something I think a lot about. If we look only at statistics, and if we claim that demography and politics and the whole baggage is deterministic, then really there's no future. I mean, for secular liberalism, for me in Israel, this is a very pessimistic view, and this is why I feel, whether it's true or not, I have to hang on to the chance that it's not all about statistics, and that people are not only numbers, and that people who are born to a Haredi family, they don't have to necessarily have also a preconditioned political package that goes with it, and that sometimes there are generational changes. Sometimes, during in history, we saw that, suddenly there was the Enlightenment, and suddenly there was a huge wave of secularization, which wasn't anticipated before. So I always have to think, and this is something I really identify with in Hannah Arendt's writings, that there's also room for the particular, and not only, the deterministic trend and statistics. There's also room for the human, for the free will, for a person's decision, for just, different zeitgeist that might suddenly happen and change people's mind. And I really don't have a choice but believe in it, because otherwise the graphs are really depressing.
I'm going to turn to John in just one second. I just want two things. One is I want to remind everyone to please submit their questions using the Q&A button. And also just to mention, apropos to your last comment, Noah, of the recent exchange in the Jewish Review of Books between Hillel Halkin and his interlocutors, where Hillel Halkin, very committed American Zionist who moved to Israel decades ago, wrote a rather depressing, to use British understatement, a very depressing account of what's happening in Israel. And then there were a couple of rejoinders, one of which simply refused to accept the notion that demography is destiny. So it's just worth bringing up. Okay, I think John is next. And then
Thanks, Noah. So I want to follow up a little bit on the comments about, you were talking about the Orthodox young and becoming more conservative. But I also thought that the youth in general in Israel are becoming more conservative, which in some ways disturbs me, or is more disturbing than the Orthodox only. And I want to kind of explore that with you, because I have a sister that lives on a kibbutz, and she tells me that her grandchildren and her children to some extent are, if not becoming more conservative, they're concerned about violence in Israel. And there is this whole sense that what happened in the election was in part, at least people try to explain it, it's in part because of the violence, whether it was the intercommunal violence following Gaza, or the violence within the Arab community, or just violence in general. And I want to get a sense, is there a lot more violence? I think there is within the Arab Israeli community, but is there a lot more violence, or is this 12 years of Bibi telling Israelis that they've got to worry, that there are, hordes of Arabs coming and there are threats all over the place? When you talk about your deterministic hopes or non-deterministic hopes, if you got a combination of the demography and this kind of fear-mongering, if it is fear-mongering, then we're going down a dangerous path. But that's one question. If we have some time, the other question I'd like to ask you is about the role of the diaspora in protest. Not so much governments, although you could comment on the Americans and the Biden position, but all of us progressives, we used to be involved in protesting the Palestinian issue. And now all of a sudden we're faced with that issue in spades, plus a liberal democratic Israel. So those are my two questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Great questions. The first one, it's really interesting to see, and I think there's really a very interesting research to be done here if there's an academic who would want to do that. Israel is really different than global trends on that issue, because we see that in most liberal democracies, I mean, if Israel is one, if you consider Israel as a liberal democracy, then in many liberal democracies, younger people are more progressive now. I mean, this is what people are talking about, how younger people, becoming more and more progressive in terms of gender issues, minorities, climate, all these progressive causes. And in Israel, it's the total opposite, total opposite. The young Israelis are becoming, as you said, more conservative. We saw that a lot of soldiers, one out of every 5 soldiers voted for Ben Gvir. This is quite extreme. And, on one hand, younger people, of course, tend to follow more stronger, more extreme voices. It's part, I mean, we do see that, in history as well. But on the other hand, I think there are also some reasons that are less philosophical. For example, Ben Gvir had a very, very good TikTok campaign. For those of you who don't know, TikTok is this social platform where most of the younger people from Generation Z now hang out in their free time. And that includes Israeli soldiers who are very active on TikTok. And he had a very, very effective campaign there, led by his son, actually. Those who are following the Israeli TikTok before the elections could see how popular Ben Gvir's son and Ben Gvir is on this platform, and there was also almost no voice to counter that. I had a conversation with a young Israeli who said he was contemplating voting for Ben Gvir, and I asked him if he knew about some of the stuff that Ben Gvir did in the past, and he was shocked because he just had no idea. He wasn't alive when Ben Gvir threatened Rabin. He wasn't alive when Ben Gvir had a very public violent incident with Rabin's daughter. He wasn't aware of all of Ben Gvir's anti-LGBT parades videos. He wasn't aware of almost anything that Ben Gvir is or did before he had this TikTok campaign that he saw. So that's also, I think, something that people, I mean, that's not as, theoretical and philosophical, but it was just effective also. And I think that also, on the question of fear politics, I think you're right that in terms of the actual violence, I mean, this is one of the quieter periods in Israel's history. In terms of security, of course, there are still rounds of, from time to time, there's war with Gaza, there are missiles, we do see terror attacks from time to time, but generally, statistically, for Israeli Jews, this is one of the quieter periods. But there is a lot of fear politics, and Ben Gvir did ride this pretty well. What happened in May, when we saw clashes between Jews and Arabs within Israel, is something that provoked a lot of, it caused a lot of fear, even if you did not experience that violence yourself. So sometimes, it's enough that there is one incident to spark the fear in the imagination of people, even if it doesn't necessarily threaten people themselves or physically or anything of that sort. So I think you're right that it's mostly the fear politics and not the actual amount of violence. And remind me your second question.
The second question was, what we keep hearing, frankly, that the diaspora is less and less an issue for Israelis, that we don't get it, and you might as well stay out of it, or if you want to do something, move to Israel, and then you can have an effect. So, what should we be doing, or do we just move to Israel?
Very important. Do not disengage. That's what you're doing now is actually part of what you should be doing. I know I spoke to a lot of, for example, I think British Jews now are really frustrated about the situation. They were very vocal against Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but I also sense their desperation. And, sometimes when the news is so bad, you just want to shut it off and disengage. And this is, I think, that would be the worst, because center-left, liberal-leaning Jews in Israel, and also Palestinians and Arabs, we need those allies. We need people out there to support our struggle, what we do. I think it's really important to stay in touch, stay informed. That's the basic. You don't have to be in Israel to do that, to care. You don't have to be in Israel to care about what's happening. My biggest fear is that people will stop caring because it's so frustrating. And I think the basic is to continuing staying informed and caring. And then, whatever you do with that care, this is a question, that has always been around. What can you do? There are all sorts of options, but that's definitely the basic step.
Thanks very much.
David, you're on.
Right. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating so far, and I'm sure it'll continue. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit them to two, both spinning off some comments you've already made. The first just has to do with the Army, the IDF. I've been reading and I've heard a number of folks raise serious concerns about the possibility of conflicts, of tension within the IDF because of the politicization of religious identity and how that is playing out. And some of those comments actually don't focus just on the enlisted soldier, but rather go to the command structure and the relationship between the new cabinet and IDF command structures. And I'm wondering the relationship between, the vulgar and the profane, the religious and the civil sides, and the separation of powers, how this is perceived and what you can enlighten us about in terms of its impact on the IDF and that kind of political tension. The second question that I'd like to get to, but I'll wait till you deal with the first, is it comes back to the diaspora. But let me leave it there for you to answer the first.
Oh, okay. I was about to write it down, the second one, but okay, great. That's easier. So regarding the IDF, first of all, for several years now, there's been an interesting trend of phenomena where because religious Zionists in Israel are more, of course, nationalistic, and they are more inclined to continue in the Aryan very combatant roles, and they have more motivation to be commanders and officers as well. We saw that there are more and more religious commanders within the army. The most, is just a basic statistical fact. And of course, it might have some kind of influence. Also, another trend that's worth looking at is that there is more and more the IDF in some places in the occupied territories is very dependent on the settlers for everyday assignments. And some of the settlers will be actually actively helping the IDF in all sorts of security roles, so that the army and the settlers become like very much a team on the ground in the way that also influences the way that the IDF operates in the occupied territories. So that's also something that I think affects the IDF from within. And then now specifically, we're facing two very problematic policy changes. One is that Bezalel Smotrich requested to separate the unit within the army that is in charge of basically the everyday lives of Palestinians in the occupied territory. This is the unit, Hala Ezrachi, the civil administration, is basically the Palestinians' government. They are in charge of every aspect of Palestinian lives in the occupied territories. And this unit, Bezalel Smotrich asked that it would be separated from the army under his direct private control. He will be choosing the commander by himself, which is unprecedented. It's really something that never happened before. And we see also we hear voices from within this unit saying like, this is crazy. This unit shouldn't be politicized. And this is quite dangerous. Also, by the way, in terms of international law, of course, this actually proves that this is not a temporary occupation, which has to be managed by military in terms of international law, but this is becoming actual annexation because this is a civil person taking charge of everyday Palestinian lives in the occupied territories. So some would, of course, say that there is already de facto annexation on the ground, so this is just proving what's already happening. But still, I think symbols and official moves still have a meaning. So this will add to the argument that is actually now going to be examined by the International Court of Justice in The Hague, whether the occupation is actually still a temporary military occupation or de facto civil annexation. The other actual policy that's very dangerous and taking place that has to do with the military is Itamar Ben-Gvir's request to be officially directly in charge of a unit within the police, which is the border police, Magav. This is the unit that usually does the policing in the occupied territories, and he wants them under his direct command. Which is also unprecedented. So these two things, if they happen, might, of course, really affect the way that the military operates, or this border police unit, which usually operates in the territories.
So let me leave that for a moment. Perhaps we'll come back to it and ask my second question. You said that the diaspora, that we should not disengage. So how should we be heard? There are those who would argue that we do things like this, and that's fine. But then the question is that sufficient? Do we want to continue simply to self-educate, or there are those who would like to have an impact, at least to be heard in Israel, in such a way as it forces those in responsible positions to take into account the views and the concerns of the diaspora community. Recently, on a number of American in conversations, the argument has been made that especially progressive liberal organizations that are strongly supportive of of Israel, but Israel as a liberal democracy, must engage their members of Congress to the point of arguing that members of Congress should encourage the American administration to increasingly send harsh messages to the Israeli government and to even hold certain kinds of support. So, for instance, one does not try and stop what is starting to evolve in the UN that has been recently presented, that you do not object to it. That if you're the Americans and you have a veto and something comes up, you don't use it. That the role now of the diaspora is to convince our governments to take a much harder stand on the Israeli government, not in the argument of undermining Israeli security or Israeli presence, but rather as an argument to make it clear how important it is for Israel to not only declare, but actually act as a liberal democracy.
You know, it's interesting. A while ago, when a war in the Ukraine broke, sorry, you saw all this worldwide engagement, and of course within Europe, and people took a stand, and people wanted sanctions and participated in private initiatives to sanction, pressure Russia or whatever. I didn't hear almost any debate on, is it legitimate to express an opinion about the war between Russia and Ukraine? But suddenly when it has to do with Israel-Palestine, then suddenly it's not okay for just citizens of the world, even if they're not Jewish, to have a political opinion of something that's happening in our own, shared global society. So that's I think quite interesting to me. And so I think, the first step, I think, is not to be afraid to take a stand if you have an opinion. If you have an opinion and you do care about what's happening in Israel-Palestine, then why not express it in all the different ways that a citizen of the world has. One of them is, of course, to lobby, petition, voice your opinion. There are lots of ways to do that. But I think still, I fear, and you probably know this more than I do, it's still a very problematic issue within the Jewish communities themselves. There are lots of arguments within the Jewish communities themselves if it's okay to criticize Israel. It's not criticizing Israel, it's criticizing Israel's government policies. And it's not against Israel's security, it's how you believe Israel will be more secure. So I think I support any initiative that will help Israel be a better place. And if Israel insists that it has a special role within the Jewish world, then it has to respect the opinion of the Jewish world as well. Unfortunately, we now see that this government is also targeting the question of who is a Jew by trying to change the law of return, which will have a great impact on world Jews. So it's not even this issue specifically, it's not even about just how you believe that Israel should be for Israelis. This is actually about Jews in other places that Israel is now trying to cut out of the definition of being Jewish. So that is definitely an issue that all Jews should have an opinion about and voice that opinion to the government of Israel.
I'll turn to John just a second. What you were saying just now reminded me of an old Israeli song that was probably written before you were born, whose refrain went, if you're for or against, take a stance. I just want to ask a quick question to get us back to religion, and the other side of the coin. So you I think said convincingly that religious elements in Israel have adopted or adapted forms of secularism, secular ideologies. But I want to ask about the other side of the story. About 20 years ago, it was a long time ago, there was a movement in Israel that came from the secular community. It was Aron HaSfarim HaYehudi, the Jewish bookshelf, and this idea that there were that we too, the secular Jews, secular Israelis, had a right to our heritage. And we're not going to let the religious tell us, what religion is. And there was the journal Eretz Acheret, and Bambi Shereg, I think, was one of the founders of it. And there was this, the notion of the secular yeshiva. When Ruth Calderon, before she got into politics, she founded this secular yeshiva called Alma in Tel Aviv. And it was a place where artists and writers and other secular people could go and study Talmud, And so that was a thing. And I don't know how much of a thing it still is. That is, to what as secular Israelis feel themselves increasingly under threat, and religiosity in Israel hardens, as it seems to be. And the Mafdal, the old religious Zionist party, which was politically quite quiescent in the very early decades of the state, and then became increasingly hardened with time, as that becomes more dominant and more aggressive, is there any life left to this notion that secular Israelis as well need to take a hold of their cultural religious heritage?
Unfortunately, I think it worked too well. I think so many seculars found themselves reconnecting or connecting with Judaism in a way that what's actually endangered is being an actual secular in Israel. There's almost no atheism in Israel. It's very rare to find someone who would actually say in Israel, actually there was a poll a few years ago, more than 80% of Israelis believe in God, or so they say in the poll. So I think in the end, all these various initiatives of Judaism as a culture, as a heritage, brought just more secular people closer to religion, in a sense. You can't really, if you're a part of that group of secular Israelis that feel closer to their religious heritage, then it's harder for you to fight things like a more religious Shabbat in Israel. Because why not? Because you're supposed to respect it, because it's your own heritage as well, it's your own tradition as well. So why be against it? That's what I think. But in any case, it was a small movement anyways. It was a very small movement to begin with. The problem is that no one is actually in the secular yeshiva, you still study Judaism. Now there's an interesting initiative that started kind of as a response to the current situation. There is a principal of a high school in Herzliya. His name is Dr. Zev Dgani, who has this new initiative to have this Yeshivat Hesder, a yeshiva for his secular high school graduates that actually teaches philosophy, arts, and secular subjects, and they're asking for the same recognition as a Jewish religious yeshiva, and they're trying to annoy the government by asking it and seeing how will they explain giving or not giving the budgets for it. But this is a first initiative that I heard of, trying to actually teach in a secular yeshiva secular content.
Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating. You referred to the high percentage of Israelis who say they believe in God. The Root Foundation, I think, did these, either it's Pew Foundation, Root Foundation, whatever, and it changed over time. So the number actually went up. in the 2010s. The percentage went even higher, which conforms to your argument about increasing religiosity. And I would guess that Israel would be the highest percentage in the OECD, even higher than the United States, which has the highest. I mean, whether Israel culturally belongs in the OECD or not is a little hard to say, but economically it does. So we've got John and Mark. John,
just want to add, Eric, also it's interesting that one of the leading Israeli singers right now, a 20-year-old something, her name is Odaya, and she's like the hottest new phenomena within younger crowds, high schoolers and 20-something. She's this like, she looks totally secular. She's like a totally secular, I don't even, it's like pop, I think, and all of her songs are about God. It's like we're in the Bible Belt. I mean, she looks like a secular singer. She wears a miniskirt on stage. She looks like a pop star, and all of her songs are about how she's becoming closer to God and all of these like religious ideas, and kids in Israel, the secular kids, they love her.
So it is like Christian rock, very much so then. Because you can turn on a radio station in so much of the United States and you think, oh, this is pleasant music, it's really fun. And then you realize after a minute what they're saying.
It's exactly what it is. And no one in Israel has yet compared her to that. I'm not sure most of the people in Israel actually even know Christian rock, pop or rock, but it's what it is.
Right. Wow. Okay, well, Mark and John. So Mark, you haven't had a chance to ask a question yet. So why don't we let Mark go and then John? Yeah.
Thank you, Noah, for your interesting answers to some of the questions, all the questions. Actually, I want to ask you something about the current coalition government and the various agreements that they've reached in coming to this coalition. Many of the sort of concessions which Prime Minister Netanyahu has made to some of the extreme right members of his coalition are dealing with some of these religious questions that we're talking about, right? The Sabbath, observing the prayer at the Kotel, and so on. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has, I think, a pretty good track record of not always keeping up to the commitments that he makes in these agreements. So, and if there's a certain degree of pressure or from other quarters within Israel and perhaps even in the diaspora, he may well decide that now's not the time to implement not allowing Reform Jews to pray at the Kotel or whatever. And my impression of Smotrich and Ben Gvir is that they're not necessarily two people who are interested in compromise or negotiation, and that they may well, this is just a theory, they may well say to him, listen, if you back down from the things that you've committed to in bringing us into the coalition, we're not going to put up with that. So if that is if that's a plausible analysis of the situation, what's your view about possible scenarios in the outcomes if that were to happen?
First of all, it was a very nice understatement that Netanyahu doesn't always keep his promises. I will quote you Bezalel Smotrich. Before the elections, there was a recording of Bezalel Smotrich that was leaked to the press, in which he said that Netanyahu is a liar, son of a liar. This is his partner saying, not me. This is, by the way, it's very interesting. It's one of the qualities that his supporters and the people who oppose them both agree on. The problem is his supporters, they like it. They think it's good that he's actually a Machiavelli kind of politician that knows how to deceive, and that's good because he's doing the same thing to the enemy. And they actually support the fact that he's a liar, son of a liar. They like it, which is quite interesting. But we still don't know how much of what's written in the coalition agreement will actually happen. Of course, usually most of the things that are written in the coalition agreements, historically, they don't happen. The problem is that this time Netanyahu is a hostage. That's the major difference. because I don't know if some of you saw what the American ambassador to Israel, Tom Knights, just said the other day about how they're going to deal with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu says he has everything under control and he's in charge and not the other extreme lunatics or whatever. The problem is, when someone is really in charge, does he need to say that? When you're really in charge of something, do you need to convince other people that you're in charge? Usually not. He didn't in the past. So we see that Netanyahu on one hand he's like, he has, it's almost like protection. It's almost like protection. He like in the mafia protection, because he tells seculars and liberals in Israel, don't worry, I will defend you. But defend us from who? For your own government that you chose. The problem is he's their hostage because he can't form a government with others. And he has his own legal issues that are as important to him as much as what, you know, the reform community might think or want. In the past, Netanyahu had pretty good relations with for example, American Jews, American Jewish leaders, etc. He had pretty good relations with them. And some of it led to some compromises around the Kotel, for example. But now he has to weigh what's more important, being out of jail or reform Jews.
Well, in fact, the other side of the coin that some people talk about is, as soon as he gets his get out of jail card, he's going to get rid of these guys, because he likes to be the puppet master, and they're controlling him now. So and I imagine they're more than aware of that and aren't going to give him his get out of jail card until they get what they want. So it's it's a mutual dependence in some ways.
Right, but is Benny Gantz I hear a lot of wishful thinking now in the center right and center left, that maybe Benny Gantz could come and replace these extremists and everything will be okay. But can Benny Gantz give him his out of jail card?
I don't think so.
Because of his political base, they're not ready for it. So that's also a problem. So he's stuck with them, and you're so right. They understand that. Bezalel Smotrich is a smart guy. He understands that that's what Netanyahu wants. So that's why they're keeping him hostage.
The only other thing I would just say by way of comment is that on the diaspora, if the Canadian government appointed a racist or an anti-Semite to the cabinet, you can bet that the government of Israel and the people of Israel would speak up about it. And so when Israel appoints racists to cabinet positions, it shocks me that we and our government still, as you suggested, are reluctant to say anything, because God forbid we should criticize Israel publicly.
John, it's even worse, because today's Israel would actually align with far-right anti-Semites. And we saw that in many countries.
Yeah, unfortunately. Hungary, Poland.
Exactly. Yes.
And Trump.
I've been saying jokingly that Israel might change its name to the Judaic Republic of Israel, sort of like the Islamic Republic of Iran, because it's not just that the country has become more right-wing, it's sort of where we started. It's this amalgam of a certain kind of public religiosity or public language of religion with a certain kind of extreme nationalism, right? And that's a little different. And so I wanted to ask you about the talk that's in the works for a new basic law, a basic law Torah study, which on one level, you know, sort of a kind of statement about the sacred or hallowed nature of studying, you know, Talmud and Talmudic texts in yeshivas, but obviously there's a lot more to it than that in terms of its political ramifications. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Another initiative, which I'm not sure will actually happen, we'll have to wait and see, but as a part of the internal debate in Israel on whether ultra Orthodox should go to the army or not, there is this effort by the ultra-Orthodox parties to declare studying Torah as important as going to the army. Of course, you know, the ultra-Orthodox argue that it's not the army, but them who are saving us from harm, because if they won't study Torah, then we will not be able to defeat any enemies, which is, I mean, in my view, absurd. Yeah, they're trying to, they just want to, they want this to be an actual legal statement or a basic law that it is as important, especially in order to kind of force the Supreme Court to take that into account in any debate around the issue of whether this fits with the basic with the concept of equality. So to counter the concept of equality in law, they want to have this basic law that will claim that actually studying Torah is important, so there is equality. It's the same.
So it sounds like it would be a new basic law to counter the 1994 final revised version of the basic law on human dignity.
Basically, the whole so-called reform that they want to do in the judicial system in Israel, it is all aimed at countering that basic law of human dignity.
Just a funny thing how, you know, we started with this notion of religiosity, public, political versus private, but there is a private aspect to it. If more and more Israelis say they believe in God, and I don't know if there's statistics studies that show, you know, our increasing percentages of Israelis attending synagogue regularly, keeping kosher. I mean, a very high percentage of Israelis keep kosher compared to American Jews.
So here's an anecdote. Israel's Master Chef program. I don't know if you have that in Canada. Do you have Master Chef?
We have it everywhere.
Okay, so Israel's Master Chef in recent years went kosher. It wasn't.
No more meat and dairy together.
But it became kosher.
What about also in the electronic media? I mean, we used to have, it was television and radio, and of course it's changed quite a bit. But I remember it was maybe a decade ago with the reform of the Israeli Radio Broadcast Authority into Khan, you had this proliferation of Jewish religious stations. And now, of course, with social media, I don't quite know how it's possible to keep track of this, where people can listen to whatever they want to, whenever they want to, and they can access anything on the web. And so do we know anything about the sort of social media, internet consumption patterns of Israelis in terms of religious content, if that's changing?
Yeah, so first of all, as I said at the beginning, there's also a secular influence on religious people, and part of it is the access to internet. I mean, I see on my Twitter feed how many ultra-Orthodox are on Twitter, for example. It's, you know, although their phones are supposed to be kosher, you just see that they're all online. And there's massive growth in religious news websites, massive. You have Kippah, Surgim, Arutz Sheva, Kol HaYehudi, I mean, so many of them.
But if your Twitter interlocutors are not, they're not on kosher cell phones because they're able to get on your, they're able to follow you on Twitter. What is this? Is this then a possible, as they say in England, a spanner in the works in terms of Haredi dominance? Because I remember, you know, I've been going to Israel on and off for almost half a century, and it was always that the Haredim are about to take over demographically. And this, you know, the people have been saying this for half a century. And the percentage of the Haredim in Israeli society, it has gone up, but it seems to be going up linearly and not exponentially, logarithmically. And it's, I mean, if the average family size is 9, 10, 11 children, this kind of demographic change should have happened a long time ago. So I'm interested in this, and to what extent there might be a kind of a neshira, a kind of a falling away of ultra-Orthodox young people. I know there's always the phenomenon of chazara b'tshuva, of people who are not, you know, Orthodox who become Orthodox, but there's also the phenomenon going the other way of chozlim b'she'elah. And to what extent this is a realistic possibility precisely because of this increased access to the internet and to secular knowledge?
So it's a good question. We see that the actual birth rate for for Jews in Israel is actually increasing. Also for secular Jewish women, it's actually increasing. Well, we see that within the Arab-Palestinian society, the more that, you know, women are educated and part of the workforce, it's actually declining. So that's also interesting. I don't know what to tell you about I mean, I don't know the data on how many of derech Haredi are there out there. It's very hard also, I think, to measure.
Right.
But what I do claim is that even people who still describe themselves as Haredi, they're different Haredim. It's true that they're not as big part of the workforce as the secular society wanted them to be, but they're more than ever.
Especially,
There are more and more Haredis.
The women are working.
Exactly, yeah.
And more of the men are working. I wrote a book that was published a decade ago when it was a third of the men are working. And now I think it's well over half.
Yes, and also the reason I say it's really hard to measure is that a lot of them work, but it's under the table. They're not paying taxes. So they want to get their they want to receive their stipend for going to yeshiva and also work on the side and not declare it. So you can't really, I mean, most of them do it because that's how they feed their children, but it's hard to measure. So that's why, yeah, I think that the Haredis are also changing.
Yeah, there is a question in the Q&A, which at first I thought was a bit far afield, but I think it actually can be relevant. The extent to which these electoral changes in Israel, people voting for more right-wing parties and right-wing religious parties, you mentioned earlier a politics of fear. I mean, one thing that came out of Israel in the last couple of years has been rising crime in the Arab sector, which has taken two forms. There's a lot of inter-Arab violence in Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab towns, villages. And there's also increasing criminality in the Negev. Bedouins, you know, stealing from Israeli properties and so on. And that creates an atmosphere of fear, an atmosphere of, you know, anti-Arab fear. And I could understand that leading someone maybe to vote for Ben-Gvir, not because, like you were saying, not because of the kippah, but simply because he stands for, you know, the strong hand, and because of his general xenophobia. And to what extent maybe it's hard to separate when people turn to these religiously oriented right-wing parties to separate just good old-fashioned xenophobia and racism from any kind of religious agenda.
So I think this is quite similar to what we saw in other countries around immigrants in immigrants communities. Sometimes in weaker populations, you see more crime. This is, and especially in Israel, also a result of neglect for many, many years. When Israel is really an expert of allowing all these like little autonomies to grow out of control without any steps towards better education, social workers, just neglecting the population and then being surprised when there's actually the results in more crime. And this is also true, by the way, it's not only true for the Palestinians in the Negev, but it's also true for the ultra-Orthodox community. When the state allows them to have autonomy and not study math or English or do whatever they want with their own in their own communities, it can't be surprised that they can't, you know, join the workforce if they don't have that knowledge. So in the same sense, the Bedouin community has been really severely neglected along the years. Of course, there's communities are unrecognized, yet in terms of official services, they don't have none, no infrastructures, no schools, no healthcare, none of the basic stuff, because Israel doesn't want to recognize their villages, and yet they exist there. Yes, there's been more crime, although I still don't think this is a phenomenon that everyone in the south of Israel actually personally experience. It's more the fear that they might experience it. And yes, and Ben-Gvir really played that card. He spoke a lot about it, although I have to say, since he took office, he didn't do anything that has to do with solving crime in the south of Israel. He only talks about the protests against the government and how to fight Palestinian flags on the streets of Tel Aviv. He hasn't done anything that has to do with what he promised.
Well, you're talking about
the voters, which is to deal with crime.
You're talking about symbolic gestures, and my final question to you, and then I'll see if my colleagues have any final questions. My final question is very much about a symbolic gesture, and a very important one. There's a rabbi in the United States, I forget his name, who has said that he will no longer recite the prayer for the state of Israel in his congregation. Wow. And okay, so you can, this gets into all kinds of interesting issues. First of all, why this prayer was created in the first place, and how and why it became sacrosanct in American synagogues, because it has a special sort of moment. The moment we're reciting the prayer for the state of Israel is a big deal in most American or North American synagogues, with the prayer for our own government kind of an anticlimax afterwards, which is very interesting. And so I was wondering what you think of that, but because time's running short, maybe I'll let David and Mark can ask their questions, then give you a chance to respond to everything, because then we'll wrap up. So first David and then Mark.
Thank you. I'm curious about what you may know from your various sources about how so-called friendly governments are viewing this new government and the expectations, if you take seriously what in fact the various parties to the governing coalition have stated and demanded and said they're going to do. What kind of impact is it having on the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs? And what kind of impact, if any, so far, is it having in terms of how governments abroad are interacting with Israel?
Mark, why don't you ask your question, and then Noah can somehow sew them together however she wishes and respond.
Actually, it's not so much a question, Derek. It's more of a clarification of your last point about the prayer for Israel.
What was that?
Because I looked into that. I was quite concerned about it when I read the article about the rabbi. And if I understand it correctly, the prayer that he was actually reciting in his congregation talked about not only the state and the people of Israel, but also the leadership of Israel, the political leader. And you could interpret it that way. If you look at our prayer book at Holy Blossom, if I can find it, I will. But our prayer, our prayer for the state of Israel doesn't make reference to the government or the leadership. And I would also point out that we do the prayer for Israel after we do the prayer for the leader for our congregation and the prayer for our own leaders in Canada, and then we go to the prayer for Israel after the Torah service. So. I think there might be some nuance here, and I think this rabbi might well reconsider the kind of words that he uses when he.
Well, the prayer for the state of Israel that was written by two chief rabbis and by Shmuel Agnon refers to Sarei HaVayotzei. It refers to the leaders of the state of Israel, and that
and I'm just saying that in ours it doesn't.
Well, you're Holy Blossom, and you are Bifnei Atzmo. Anyway, Noah, the last words are yours.
Regarding the prayer, what I do is I separate the concept of Israel from its current government and policies. It's not the same. It's not the same to me as an Israeli. It shouldn't be the same for you. I do wish Israel well, but I don't agree with its government's policies. These are just two different issues. And I think you can also, I mean, it's the same for prayers. You can still pray for Israel, but it doesn't necessarily need to be, has to mean its current political form. In the same way that when I talk about what's pro or anti-Israel, I don't necessarily, I always emphasize if something is anti-current Israeli policies and not just anti-Israel. Regarding how other countries are responding to this, there are two problems. One is that Israel, the first of all is that I don't really trust the world to save us from ourselves, because the world never saves anyone from themselves. I mean, look at what's happening in Ukraine. Look at what happened at Syria. Look at, you know, other periods in our history. You can't really trust that, you know, that other countries will do our work. If I look at even the way that the EU is now dealing with Hungary or Poland, they can't even, you know, resolve that. So how would they, you know, solve our problem? They don't know how to treat the fact that, you know, Hungary is now an illiberal country within the EU. So I'm not really trusting the EU to solve this in Israel-Palestine. But yeah, there are, of course, small steps within diplomacy and pressures that could help. There are some red lines that I'm sure the Americans will have. Although for the Biden administration, there are three main issues in foreign policy currently, and there are China, China, and China, and none of them is Israel. So I'm also not counting on Biden for that. Yeah, so I think they will have some red lines that Israel will somehow have to consider. But generally speaking, I mean, in terms of everyday diplomacy, when the world strongly condemns and all sorts of, you know, those statements, for most Israelis, it's just they don't even hear that. I mean, in the Israeli culture, understatement is not something that the Israeli ear even hears. I always tell diplomats, you know, who tell me, but we strongly condemn this, that, you know, no one cares if you don't. The Israeli government that doesn't care about strong condemnations. So not very optimistic about that, but I am pretty sure that there will be some red lines within the international communities that will have some effect.
Well, this has been very wide-ranging and fascinating conversation, and it leaves me, I can't say this is good news necessarily, but it leaves me thinking that in so many ways, and this is maybe in the long run good as well as bad, that Israel has become a real Middle Eastern country. That is, Israel has been accused from its foundation of being a Western implant. And its secularism was in many ways a Western implant, although Arab states had their secularist moment. It faded quite a bit sooner than Israel's. And in its public religiosity, and now the even tighter marriage of religion and politics, you know, I think that Israel in many ways, yeah, you could compare it with American evangelical Christianity perhaps, but no, that's voluntarist. Where in, you know, in these other countries, it's very much state supported and state driven. And in, I don't know, Israel, it's an odd country in that it has Western and also Middle Eastern components. And then of course it has components that are unique. And I think that our discussion today has illustrated all of those aspects of it. So I want to thank you, Noah, for joining us. You know, it's late over there in Israel, and thank you for joining us. And thank you as well for the essential work that you do, you know, editing Haaretz, which I think all of us depend upon. It's the first thing I open up every morning. you know you're in trouble in the United States when you find probably opening up Haaretz will be less frightening than opening up the New York Times. So I always open up Haaretz first. Anyway, so thank you again. It's been great to see you, and thank you as always to Mark and to John and to David and to Rabbi Kay, of course, and to Les for helping make this all possible.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And of course, subscribing to Haaretz is one definite thing that you should all do to help us continue.
Okay, we'll do our part.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you.
Very much.
Well, I have a screaming toddler, so I will just thank everyone for joining us, and just say that in regards to the question of prayer and synagogues that pray, one of the grand questions in general that theologians and liturgists have been asking for a very long time is, are prayers aspirational or descriptive? And do we pray to a God and with a God that fulfills our prayers, or to and with a God that we hope will fulfill our prayers? And the same thing can be true of the state of Israel. Does the prayer for the state of Israel describe the way that it is, or does it yet describe the way that we hope that it can be? And so with that thought, I will close us up. Thank you, Noah, so much for joining us. Thank you to our distinguished panel, and we will return next week with another session of the Israel Dialogues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.